This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn Law professor, kicks off today's show with his fourth and fifth top developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2023. Keeping the show rolling is Mark Nelson, Kansas Farm Bureau's Director of Commodities, from his recent Winning the Game webinar with Dan O'Brien discussing marketing plans. K-State's Beef Cattle Institute concludes today's show with a segment from their Cattle Chat podcast. Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster talk about what producers should have prepared for calving season. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show continuing to talk about the top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments in 2023. And to talk about them, we're joined by K-State and Washburn Law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today talking about number 5 and number 4 from that top 10 list. And number 5 is the Corps of Engineers mismanaging water levels in the Missouri River.
Yeah, this actually started over a decade ago, and it was a problem that was created that goes all the way back, actually almost 20 years ago, but the lawsuit started in 2014 when you had about 400 farmers along the Missouri River from Kansas to North Dakota that sued the federal government, claiming that what the Corps did in terms of managing the water levels in the Missouri River caused repeated flooding of their farmland along that Missouri River corridor. And they claim that the flooding that occurred as a result of what the Corps did in 2007 and 8 and then 10 and 11 and 13 and 14 got so bad that it amounted to a taking by the federal government of their farm ground, which triggered compensation under the Fifth Amendment. That was their claim.
And something kind of associated in with this, the master manual from the Corps of Engineers?
Yeah, the Corps changed their manual in 2004, and they said, well, we've got to have more water in the Missouri River to comply with Endangered Species Act requirements. And they did that even though we had a record amount of snowmelt in the state of Montana that was filling up the Missouri River, and it was already at high levels. And then they released more water because of the change in their manual, which they said they had to because of endangered species requirements under the Endangered Species Act. They released more water from the Gavins Point Dam in South Dakota, which created what was already a flooding issue into a massive flooding problem. And that's what the farmers alleged constituted a taking.
So what did the farmers say kind of when they've gotten to court and in with the government?
Well, their basic claim, again, was that this was a Fifth Amendment taking, that the government, you can do this, but because you destroyed our property and we can't farm it, you've destroyed our crops, our growing crops, our planted crops, you have to pay us for that. You're the big bad government. You can do that, but the Constitution requires you to pay for it. And in essence, their property law claim was that the government took a flowage easement on their property. And by taking that, that's a property right that was taken from the farmers along the Missouri River corridor that the government had to pay for.
What is the government going to have to pay these farmers?
Well, the courts did agree with the farmers that a flowage easement was taken, and it is compensable under the Fifth Amendment, and so the legal issue is done. Now we're just down to the damages, and the appellate court said that, yes, this also includes crops that were destroyed and crops that would have been planted and future damages for those farmers. So it's going to be a massive amount that the federal government's going to be responsible for paying for these farmers by acquiring a flowage easement impermissibly under the Constitution.
And this isn't just farmers in Kansas, correct?
Correct. There's just a few in Kansas, in the extreme northeast corner of Kansas, but this is all along the corridor, Nebraska, Iowa, a little bit in Minnesota, and South Dakota and North Dakota, pretty much all the way up to Fargo.
Roger, is it fair to say then that basically everything's done, but just waiting to see what that number is of what gets paid out?
Yeah, we're down to the issue of the expert's computation of damages. So this is the expensive, if there is a more expensive phase of the litigation, this is it. But the legal principle is settled, and that is that the Corps is going to have to pay for what they took, and they took a flowage easement.
Roger, moving on to number 4 of these top 10 developments, and this one involving the Employee Retention Credit. And what is that?
Well, the employee retention credit was a mess, is what it is. Technically, it's a refundable tax credit that was created in 2020 as a result of what economic problems were created by the virus in 2020. It was revised in 2021, and what it is was if you had a business with a certain number of employees, the government was going to, and you were affected by, I should say this, you were affected by a state governor that required you to shut your business down, then the federal government came in and said, well, we'll give you what's known as a credit, a refundable credit to incentivize you to keep your employees on the payroll. So if you have to shut down but you still have to meet payroll, well, that's going to create substantial economic harm to you. So here comes this tax credit in saying, here, now based on the number of employees you had, based on your drop in revenues, you had to show a decline in revenues by a certain percentage. You could apply for this credit, and it could be massive in terms of dollars amounts. It could be really high. But you had to show a drop in your revenue or that you were affected by a government shutdown or at least a partial shutdown. And this was pitched to a lot of farmers.
So more than likely, farmers and ranchers' income wasn't impacted by the virus because they just kept doing their job?
Right. Farmers basically didn't shut down. They were not subjected to any government order. I mean, how stupid would you have to be to order farmers to stop producing? That's not going to work. And so farmers were not affected by a government shutdown or a partial shutdown. And the IRS said that supply chain disruptions don't count for this. Now, some farmers were affected by that. That was a major problem in getting supplies and getting parts, but that doesn't count in terms of being affected by a government shutdown. And so it really fell back to whether you showed a sufficient enough reduction in revenues to still get the credit. Well, you look back in 20 and 21, and your base year for computation was how far your revenue declined compared to 2019. And if we look at the data for those years, those were pretty good years. And so most farmers didn't show a reduction in revenue, at least not to the extent required to get the credit. But yet the fraudsters grabbed hold of this credit and started pitching it to all types of people, even those that didn't have businesses, as well as to farming operations. And there were claims that were filed, and then after the fact, some farmers, in fact, a lot of farmers and a lot of other businesses realized that, oh, we really weren't eligible for that credit. Now we've got a problem.
For that mess that was created, what if they're realizing I'm not someone who is eligible for that?
Well, the IRS realized that this was so bad that they stopped processing employee retention credit claims for the fourth quarter of 2023. So no claims were processed for October, November, and December, even if it was a legitimate claim. They just said, we can't keep up with the fraud on this. We're not going to process any more claims. Then they came in the very late part of 2023 and created an amnesty program that said that if you pay it back, we're not going to come after you. We're going to give you amnesty. And basically, this is a voluntary disclosure program that you've got until middle of March to comply with. And basically what it has evolved into is if you will pay back 80% of what was provided to you and you think that you now realize you shouldn't have received anything, if you'll just pay us back 80% of what you received, then we'll leave you alone. You won't be audited. You won't be subject to fines and penalties because the fines and penalties can be terrible once IRS finds this out. And so IRS knows they've got an administrative problem. They're trying to get people in this amnesty program so they don't have to go through all of this. It takes a lot of man hours to do this, but they will find those claims, and then you can get hit with penalties and interest on that, and it would be awful. And so they're just saying, pay us 80% back if you think you filed a fraudulent claim, or now you know that you did. You didn't know it at the time, but now you know that you did, and we'll leave you alone. And they're going to also, they've announced they're really ramped up the prosecution of these fraudsters that have created these mills that have been churning these credit claims.
For people who have realized they've done a fraudulent claim, when do they need to have that submitted back to the IRS?
Well, they have to. This program is going to close on March 22, 2024. So a business has to apply to the voluntary disclosure program by that time, and certain qualifications have to be satisfied for a business to participate in that program. You can find information of that on the IRS website if you're interested in that voluntary disclosure program. But this was such a mess. Normally, a tax credit that's not specifically associated with agriculture would never make my top 10 list. But this became so bad and such a systemic problem that affected so many farmers, it ends up in my top 10 list.
And as we're talking about taxes, what should maybe producers do to make sure they don't fall into a trap or a mill like this again?
On this one specifically, if you weren't affected by a shutdown, and you probably were not as a farmer, and if you were affected by a supply chain disruption, that doesn't count. And if you didn't have a sufficient drop in revenue, and it's an 80%, 20% cutoff compared to the same calendar quarter in 2019, then you're not going to be eligible. And so if you receive something, if you filed a claim, you had one of these mills file a claim for you, and they took a percentage of what your amount of the credit would be, then pay 80% back of what you received, and you're going to be in the clear. In terms of trying to avoid similar things like this in the future, always talk to your tax professional first. This is something that we addressed numerous questions on in the K-State tax schools in the fall of 23. We're still addressing the questions as we start tax season now in terms of particularly this voluntary disclosure program and how do we get rid of these bogus claims. But always talk to your tax professional first and before you get into something with a group that might not be reputable or that you haven't heard of before. So always do your research, talk to your tax practitioner, have them look up things for you just to make sure that it's all on the up and up.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us your number 4 and number 5 for top agricultural law and tax developments in 2023.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. You can read more on these by going to Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or I will also link them in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show with Director of Commodities from Kansas Farm Bureau, Mark Nelson, with a snippet of his recent webinar with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. This webinar is titled Winning the Game. Mark starts off his conversation with discussing soybeans and the marketing plan.
Where are we at with soybeans? Typically, we'll have about 51% of a crop that we put into storage, whether it be commercial or whether it is on farm. And then we're trying to sell that afterwards. Here is just a quick analysis, but it looks at the last 15 years of Kansas soybean prices, right? So on November, the average November price, according to NASS, has been $10.42. Commercial storage, high interest. And in my definition for that, I'm using 7%. And so I took that 10.42, added 7% interest, and I'm also using about 6.5 cents commercial storage. But not everybody uses commercial storage, and so I've got a few other ones in here. I've got on-farm low interest, I got on-farm high interest, I've got commercial low, and I've got commercial high interest. And again, on the interest side, I'm just looking at 7% interest versus, on your operating notes versus, say, 3.5%, which might be more of an opportunity cost. And then, again, just kind of running through there, on my on-farm storage, I'm making the assumption that we've got a 1% shrink based on that November price. And then a 5-cent in and out charge. It's using utilities, it's using labor. We can agree, disagree, but those are the things I'm using. And basically, so when we ask that question, does storage pay? Soybeans, on average, at least the last 15 years, and according to what I'm looking at, it has paid fairly well. But again, that doesn't mean everybody. So as we think about implementing our plans, September, October is kind of when we should be developing that post-harvest plan, making that decision of, okay, how many bushels do I want to put in storage? How many do I just want to sell off the combine? And those kind of decisions. And really, it's that October, November period when we're in the heat of harvest that we're making those decisions. October, November, what was prices doing? Prices were rallying. I mean, my gosh, it was looking great. And so if you kind of think about, well, has storage typically paid for me? Corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans? You'd say, man, okay, price is trending higher, I should store. Unfortunately, right, pretty much right after we made that decision, prices started heading south, and they really haven't slowed much. I mean, for the last 3 weeks, we've been kind of moving sideways, but I mean, we're really taking a hit. And so it's been pretty ugly. Okay, so I did the same kind of analysis, not a 15-year average, but this is what I think is happening this year. In November, prices were $13, according to NASS. Now, I've got question marks for December and January, and the reason for that is because the NAST data is kind of lagging. So I'm kind of looking at futures and trying to make a relationship, but I think most people would agree prices have definitely trended lower. If you still got beans in the bin, I think you're probably anywhere from $1 to $1.25 behind where we would have been if we just sold at $13 there at harvest. Corn, probably about 50 cents in the hole. Wheat, I don't even want to talk about it. But this kind of then brings us back to our decisions, right? It's time now to make some decisions. If I've still got grain, whether it be oil seeds, soybeans, or corn in storage, or wheat even, I need to make that decision. Do I continue to store this physical commodity or do I move it, right? And if I sell it, do I just say, okay, I'm done. I'm going to take my wounds and start focusing on 2024? Or do I want to reown? And really the things that are going to play into this decision are, A, your basis expectations. Where do we think basis is going to go? Historically, places I've looked as far as corn basis, milo basis, typically it's pretty flat, really from, Jan, Feb, up through May. Now, we might see some strengthening in basis in the feed grains into the summer months. On the bean side, at least in eastern Kansas, typically the ones I've looked at here lately, typically seasonally, we'll kind of see some actual weakness. And so meaning cash prices might be weakening faster than futures. So the thing we need to be thinking, do I hang on to this stuff or not? We got to ask that question. Do I feel lucky, right? Do I feel like we're going to see basis strengthen? Do I feel like we're going to see prices strengthen? Again, seasonally, basis is pretty flat on corn, feed grains, up through the next 90 days or so. Beans, I'd argue, typically might even see some weakness. I'm going to turn my attention now and start looking up at the new crop side. And specifically, we're going to kind of focus on corn here. Historically, 43% of Kansas is sold either before or at harvest. And so we're storing about 57% of the crop. Now, again, obviously, we've got some producers that's priced it all early or off the combine. And we've also got farmers in Kansas that store the whole crop. But when we look at the crop in aggregate, 43% historically is going to be sold before or after. So definitely preseason marketing plan is important. Pre-harvest marketing plan is important to put together. So regardless of what you're doing post-harvest, it's good. But also, there are some opportunities, right? You see that circles there. I've got May, June, part of early into July. Typically, we will see that December corn futures, right? This is a 15-year seasonal index of December corn futures, and that's what we want to use for hedging. We'll see prices well above at harvest or even after that post-harvest near-term rally that sometimes we see in futures. And so there's opportunities to price, and we need to have a plan. Something that Dan and I have always talked about and stressed is that when you develop that marketing plan, you need to have three key components, and that are pricing increments, you need to have pricing targets, and we need to have pricing dates. Pricing increments is basically saying how much do we want to price each time. And that also then implies how many times do I want to price. Other things that are very important to know your costs, right? We need to know what our costs are. When we do workshops, Dan and I stress that very, very hard. We also suggest you learn about different marketing tools, right? By and large, everyone's very familiar with, say, forward cash contracts. But I think it's important also to kind of start using and thinking about how we might use futures or options. And then also it's so important to create and work with a marketing team. Whether that's your banker, whether that's your broker, whether that's your spouse and business partners, all those folks probably should be a part of your marketing team. All right, so how do we set pricing targets? What's a relevant target? Well, one way of looking at it is this. We look at December futures. I think it's a great index. I think it's a great thing to kind of just use because we're all aware of that. And so what I did, just a quick thing here, we looked at the last 15 years, and we're comparing January 1 price. That's kind of our index. And then what happens after that? And I'm kind of looking at between then and September 30, because I consider that the pre-harvest phase, January 1 through September 30. And I said, how high? What was the highest price we ever got? And so, you do that table, 2009, January, the first trading day in January, we were at $4.56. The highest daily close between then and September 30th in 2009 was $4.73. So 17 cents, not much higher than it was in January 2nd, and that was a 4% price change. The other spectrum down here, we've got 2023. Last year, we were at 607. The highest it got was 629, which is 22 cents. But you can kind of look in there, changes. There's some pretty good years. Now, on average, harvest begins in Kansas about September, and we're 75% complete by October 30. So that's why I'm kind of using these.
He continues his presentation with an example of a good pre-harvest marketing plan.
Obviously, our objective is to buy crop insurance, right? We want to protect our production risk. We want to maximize the price received on any bushels sold before or at harvest. And again, typically, what is that? On corn, I think that's like 43%. We're going to be moving before or at harvest. So let's try to set some prices. And what I'm using here is, I got priced 20% at $5.65, which is what? A 65-cent rally, right? We don't want to ignore. If I see prices jump up there, hey, let's get something on the books, right? Let's get something on the books and get that sold. But if not, right, that first line, number one, price 20% at $5.65 December futures or by June 1, right? Because a lot of times we'll see that rally up there into that June period. So let's, but if we don't, let's get something on the books. Now, I've got pricing increments, 20%, 10%, 20%, and 25%. I've got pricing targets, $5.65, $6.25, $7, and $7.25. That's that aggressive price target, right? Because we want to be patient. I want to make sure we're going to see a good rally before I price a significant amount of my crop. So I want to be patient, but I don't want to ignore those 50 to 75-cent rallies. And so I want to have some aggressive price targets. And that's what I'm doing with that 7 and that 7.25. I've also got my pricing dates. So what I'm getting at here is that if we don't hit $7, I'm not going to price any anyway, right? I'm just not going to do it. So what does this plan do for me? Well, this plan is basically designed to price at least 30% of my APH production before harvest. But if we see a $2.25 rally, heck, we'll go clear up to $7.25 or 75% of my expected production, right? That's what this plan is trying to do. But at a minimum, we're going to be pricing 30%. Let's say now, haven't talked about pricing tools. Obviously, on these early ones, we typically would suggest you look at things more like cash-based, something we're very comfortable with, something that doesn't have a lot of cost with it. So, you think forward cash contract, possibly a hedge to arrive contract, something, because at this point, too, it's 20% of my APH production. Pretty good odds I'm going to produce that. I don't have much worry that, drought or something comes up, I'm not going to grow it. 10%, I'm waiting for a higher price, right? I'd probably stick with that maybe that cash-based one. Again, maybe a forward cash contract, hedge to arrive contracts. These other ones, the last 20%, the next 20%, the next 25%, at that point, okay, maybe we can continue to use, forward cash contracts, but maybe at this point we may want to start moving over and looking at futures, looking at some of these, options, maybe buying a put, using those instead, because maybe I don't have as much confidence that I'll be actually producing that large of a percent. Last thing on marketing plans, if you're using cash marketing alternatives like forward cash contract, never price at less than your expected cost of production. And that's why knowing what your cost of production is so important.
Once again, that was Director of Commodities at Kansas Farm Bureau, Mark Nelson. I will put a link in today's show notes if you'd like to listen to the full Winning the Game webinar. You can also find it on AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Clout in for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Phillip Lancaster from the Beef Cattle Institute.
So our next listener question, guys, was from a relatively new producer. I want to get ready for the calving season, and what should I have prepared, ready to go?
We're really concerned about that difficult birth. And probably the most important thing you need is make sure you have the information you need. So phone number of your veterinarian and some sort of calving training. And again, that might be, an experienced person on your ranch or operation, because you want to be clean, you want to be gentle, but you want to know when you can apply pretty good force and when to not. Here in Kansas, AJ Tarpoff does some great extension meetings with calving schools. Those types of things, so that you feel comfortable. Now, once you have the knowledge, you also need some equipment. I like a good pair of calf chains that you can clean easily, and it's not a bad idea to have some extras, some sort of a handle, and a lot of times we'll lose those handles. So really any, even an old broom handle or something like that, cut off into about 8-inch sections you can wrap chains around.
Just get a handle.
Oh, but they're expensive, and I lose them. If I have this old 8-inch piece of wood, I never lose it.
Or just get a handle.
Okay. But so you need some of that equipment, and you're going to need a bucket. You're going to need some disinfectant because, again, it's really important to stay clean. I'm trying to not introduce, bacteria into that birth canal and those kinds of things. It's not going to be sterile, but I do want to be really clean. And then, so I've got the knowledge. I've got some equipment. The other thing is just facility to confine the cow. And squeeze chutes aren't my favorite for dealing with a difficult birth, but sometimes that's all I have. What I prefer is like a head catch or even a halter with a good post or something like that. So a good facility, again, cleanliness with good lighting would be ideal. So sometimes that means bringing in some electrical lights. Sometimes that means having an area where you can keep it scraped and cleaned and brought in fresh straw, those types of things. I don't know what other ideas you guys might have.
Well, you took all the good ideas, I think. Philip?
Well, so I guess we were just talking about colostrum and difficult births. So, I think some things to make sure you've got on hand are some colostrum and the esophageal feeder so that you've got it, because you don't have time to go get one when you need it. And then also some milk replacer and bottles, so if you have a calf that you have to start bottle feeding. And then maybe even have a plan and stuff to cross-foster calves so that you don't have to bottle feed a calf for a long period of time if you've got a cow that lost her calf or whatever. So having a plan to be able to get that cross-foster set up and the facilities to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would expand on both of you guys mentioned facilities. And I think one of the things that's really important is having a plan for whatever pasture they're in when we're calving, that I have a mechanism to get them from that pasture to wherever I need to confine them. Because sometimes that's a walk, sometimes we're going to have to load her on a trailer, sometimes we're going to have to do something different. But have a plan for doing that, or I may have a portable pen that I'm going to set up that I'm going to use if I have to catch somebody there, but I'm going to set it in an area that I can easily walk them in. So I think having some of those things is going to be important. But Bob, briefly, give me an idea of, you said I need to have my vet's number and I need to kind of understand what's going on. Give me a trigger of when I should call.
Okay. Basically, what I like to go by is cows that don't progress. And so it's basically the same rule for both heifers and cows. But heifers, it's basically the same rule. But with heifers, I'm going to watch them more frequently because I have more calving difficulty in my heifers. And what I'm looking for is, those first signs of impending birth might be just being, uncomfortable. But if she's laying down and pushing, I need to see progress in a half an hour. And if I don't see consistent progress each 20 or 30 minutes, then something is probably needing to be evaluated.
Absolutely. I think a good point there. So progress, 15 or 20 minutes. If I see a foot, if I don't see more in 15 or 20 minutes, it's time to call, intervene, think about doing those things. So the one other thing that I would recommend is, it's exciting when that's going on. Go ahead, write that down.
Yeah, write down the
times so that you know when to call.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today. We'll be back with more for you tomorrow.